أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وآله الطيبين الطاهرين اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. Respected brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I sincerely welcome you to our third year of Islamic beliefs, the Aqaid course that we have. We started the first year by examining the need for religion, the existence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the attributes of the Almighty God. We examined prophethood. We examined imamah last year in detail, the infallibility, the knowledge of the imams. And we ended by examining certain discussions about Al-Imam Al-Mahdi ajjalallahu ta'ala farajahu al-sharif. This year we will begin our course by examining a number of features that we have in our school of thought, in the Ja'fari or the Shia school of thought. And then we will transition into the discussion on the soul, death, barzakh, and the Day of Judgment, inshallah. In our discussion tonight, we will examine a very fundamental point that is misunderstood by many people, that is sometimes controversial. It's very important to examine this point from an intellectual, rational perspective, then also from the perspective of the Quran and the Hadith. This is the issue of Taqlid. Last year we examined the occultation of Al-Imam Al-Mahdi ajjalallahu ta'ala farajah. So we're transitioning into the role of scholars. In the absence of the Imam, who represents the Imams? So this discussion comes naturally after the discussion on the 12th Imam of Ahlul Bayt, peace be upon him. Because when the Imams are present, it's obvious that they are the source of guidance and people refer to them and ask them. But in their absence, what kind of system did the Imams of Ahlul Bayt put in place so people can refer to? So people can seek guidance from that system. So our discussion tonight will be Taqlid. In Arabic, what does Taqlid mean?
Following someone?
Well, that's the meaning, yes, to follow someone, to emulate someone. But the linguistic meaning comes from which root word? Qilada. Qilada in Arabic means what? Necklace. Why do you think Taqlid is derived from the root word which means necklace in Arabic? What does Taqlid have to do with necklace? Any ideas? It's a symbolic meaning embedded here.
Is it that it's binding on your neck?
You have the right idea. Basically, when you emulate someone and you take their fatwa, it's as if you take your religion and you put it on their neck. So now they are responsible for these rulings. In other words, the person whom you're following, whom you're emulating, is taking a huge responsibility, which is the religion of people. So that's the origin of this word taqlid. You put something on someone's neck. You put a necklace on someone's neck. That means it's on you now. I will follow your fatwas. But whether you did due diligence, whether you're honest with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in every detail, that's up for you to decide. Yes, I do see you as someone qualified, but it's a great responsibility on you. So this is the origin of the word. Now in discussing taqlid, emulating and following a scholar, we have two dimensions here. One, the rational, intellectual dimension, and one is the narrational dimension. And by that we mean the Quran and the ahadith of Ahlul Bayt, peace be upon them. Let's first start by examining the rational basis for taqlid. Imagine we had no verse in the Holy Quran, absolutely no hadith that speaks of taqlid, that authorizes taqlid, that sanctions or justifies taqlid. Do we have a rational principle that mandates on the human being to do taqlid in religious matters or no? The Holy Quran is very clear. مَا آتَاكُمُ الرَّسُولُ فَخُذُوهُ. Whatever the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam brings you in the form of teachings, accept it. So we are obligated to implement the teachings of the Prophet and the teachings of the Imams of Ahlul Bayt. Now the rational law states, if you're not there to hear the Prophet directly, if you were not there to hear the Imams directly, you are removed from the Prophet and the Imams 14 centuries away. The rational principle here states that you should refer to someone who's an expert in knowing what the Prophet and the Imam said. If you yourself, you have the capacity to do that, you don't do taqlid of anyone. Let's say, I know the chain of transmissions, I can go to the hadith sources, I know which are the valid sources, I can examine each narrator. I know the content, I know the Arabic language. If there are two contradictory hadiths, what do I do? The historical context behind those hadiths. If I know all of that, I don't need to do taqlid. But the reality is, because we're 14 centuries away, and these sources are more than 1,000 years old, so many challenging events in history happened with these sources, you have to spend years and years and years to become that expert. The Arabic language in itself requires someone who grew up in a purely Arabian environment, or someone who dedicates years in studying Arabic. Because the texts that we have, Quran and Sunnah, are in Arabic. So if I master the Arabic language, I can read the hadiths, I know the sources, I have a holistic picture of all these hadiths and the context in which they were said, I don't need to follow anyone. Basically, you're confident what the Prophet said, what the Imam said, act upon it. In reality, you're following the Prophet and the Imams. In reality, we're not following any scholar here. Our first object of emulation is the Prophet and the Imam. Whatever they said, we take it. Now here's the challenge that we have. I am now 14 centuries away from that era. 13 centuries, 12 centuries from some of the Imams. If I am not qualified to go through all these steps, what does the rational intellectual law dictate? What does it dictate? That if I don't know, if I'm not an expert in knowing these hadiths, in knowing the Quran and the tafsir of the Quran and the depths of the Quran and the hadiths which explain the Quran, because the Prophet was very clear, don't just take the Quran by itself. You need the Ahlul Bayt to shed light on the Quran. If I'm not an expert, the intellectual law dictates what? Refer to an expert. Refer to an expert. So it's a very simple intellectual, rational law that every society understands and every society is based upon. You're not a doctor. You don't know how to deal with medical issues. Refer to a doctor. You're not a lawyer. Refer to a lawyer. You're not an engineer. Refer to an engineer. So this is a rational law that we find in society. So if I am not an expert, I simply refer to an expert. Are there any objections to this part of the argument? This is the basis for taqlid. Now we can discuss the details of taqlid. That's fine, that's another discussion. But at its very core, are there any objections to this rational principle? Imagine you had no hadith, no verse in the Quran that mandates taqlid on you. Do you find that your intellect mandates on you to do taqlid, or there are objections to this? Any possible objections? Yes.
Fitra, you're born with some innate knowledge that you know.
That's a very good observation. We have what's called the fitra, which is this built-in system that Allah has given us to know right from wrong. Yes, every person is born on the fitra. However, the fitra reveals the basics of right and wrong. Dhulm, injustice is wrong. The fitra recognizes that. Justice is good. The fitra recognizes that. Right? Concealing the truth, lying at a very basic level, the fitra may recognize that. But the details of God's law, how do you pray, how do you fast, the financial dues, the economic system, the political system, the social system, the fitra does not know that. The fitrah has a built-in compass to know right from wrong at a very basic level. The fitrah tells you you have a Lord, worship that Lord. He's worthy of being worshipped. But how do you worship that Lord? What exactly does that Lord want you? The fitrah cannot show that. The fitrah falls short of revealing the details. So the fitrah cannot show you the details. The fitrah gives you the basics. I have a Lord, I have a creator, and my creator has a right over me. That much the fitrah can recognize. But what exactly does this Lord want from me? How does He want me to live? What kind of lifestyle should I have? The fitrah does not have the power to reveal that. So I need something more, definitely. And I do recognize that I need to follow the Prophet and the Imams. But the question is how? If the Prophet is sitting here, you don't need any scholar, any marja. Just listen to what he says and implement it. But the problem is I'm 14 centuries away from the Prophet. How do I know what he said? This requires experience and expertise. This requires knowledge to know what the Prophet said. And in reality, the scholar or the marja or the mufti, whoever it is, they spend years in seminaries, in colleges, trying to figure out what the Prophet said. That's all really they're doing. For a lot of them, for a lot of schools of thought, their main intent is just to figure out what the Prophet said. Now that we figure out what he said, well, what does it mean? Let's analyze it. That's all. That's all we're referring to. Nothing more than that, really. So at a very basic level, Taqlid is sanctioned by intellectual law. Now there's one objection here. One could argue, but if this is a rational principle, that you have to follow the experts themselves disagree. The experts themselves have various opinions, various contradictory fatwas. So how can the rational law of following the mujtahid, how can the intellect trust these experts when they disagree with one another? Because the argument is that whole system is invalidated, it's disqualified because there's so much disagreement. So now the intellect recognizes the haqq is not with them, the full haqq, because they disagree. So where's the haqq? The intellect is telling you follow them because you want to arrive at the truth. How can you follow at the truth when they're disagreeing with each other? Then the intellect knows, look, there's something that doesn't add up here. You have, let's say, 10 maraja', they have different fatwas, maybe 10% difference. Well, then I've lost the truth. I don't have access to 10% of the truth. So why do taqlid? That's an objection. The answer to that is, in fact, it's expected for them to have some differences of opinion. It's only natural. They are looking at the same truth. All the scholars are looking at the Quran, it's the same Quran that they're examining, and it's the same hadiths. They're looking at one image, which is the truth. However, how that image is reflected to them, the angle from which they're seeing the image will generate some minor differences. And that's only natural. I'll give you an example. Let's say you have an intersection here, Ford and Beach Daily, an accident happens. Now before they install cameras on the intersections, when there is an accident, the police comes, they're filing for the accident report. They ask witnesses to testify what they saw, right? What is it exactly that you saw? Imagine if you have 4 witnesses. They're reliable and they're truthful. They're standing in 4 directions because you have an intersection. From each side, you have a witness who saw the accident. Now the police is writing exactly what these witnesses testified. Do you think you will get the same exact report from each witness? No. Why not? They're all truthful. No one's lying here. They all have good intentions. In fact, they're accurate people. They try to give you the most accurate description of the event that they saw in front of them. But why do you have some discrepancy in the report? Yes, they all agree on the big picture of what happened, but the details, there might be some differences. Why?
Different perception, different variables in terms of direction. So
different angles. I am seeing the accident from this side. I'm seeing what you don't see. It's only natural that you get these differences. The same concept applies to the maraja. They're all seeing the hadith and the Quran, but each comes from their unique background. The sciences that they've learned, their understanding of the Arabic language, their understanding of history, their understanding of expressions and idioms. Because the Holy Quran is based on expressions and idioms. A lot of the statements are not to be taken literal. They have a meaning in the Arabic language. Well, each person can understand that slightly differently. So when you put the fatwa of the maraja next to each other, 90% of it is the same. I can confidently tell you 90% of it is exactly the same. We have thousands of rulings, 90% are the same. That difference is in 10%, 5%. Why? Each is coming from a unique perspective. Does that mean the system is invalid? Absolutely not. They're looking at the truth, but how are they're seeing the truth and conveying the truth to you? There can be some variations and differences here. And it's the same with every professional field. You will have 100 doctors who graduated from Wayne State and they took the same exact courses and they all did well. And they passed the MCAT. Now when they're practicing and they're dealing with situations, yes, you can expect, that there is some level of consistency. Maybe in 80% of the issues they will give you the same prescription or they'll diagnose the same condition. But in 20% of the issues, 10% of the cases, there will be differences. Why? Didn't they study in the same university? Didn't they read the same text? Didn't they have the same professors? Does that disqualify the system? Absolutely not. Because each has their own perspective. So this objection here does not invalidate the intellectual law that I still need to refer to an expert. Secondly, the intellect tells you, okay, what better alternative do you have? Fine. You don't want to refer to the experts because they disagree in 10% of the issues? What's your alternative? That's going to get you to the truth better than they would. Do you have a better alternative? Sit and flip a coin and say, okay, if it's heads, I'm going to implement this fatwa. If it's tails, I'm not.
Well, that's wrong.
Seriously, what do you do?
Become a scholar yourself.
Become a scholar. We said in the beginning, if you have the capacity to be a scholar, it's highly recommended to be a scholar. But let's say you don't. You're not an expert yet. What do you do? What's your other alternative? So the law of the intellect dictates that you should follow an expert. This is the first point. The second point here is, if we're referring to intellectual laws, why can't I engage in what is called tab'id fi taqlid? Why can't I choose any qualified scholar and follow that scholar in whatever area I want? I follow X marji' in the book of Salah and the laws of Salah. But when it comes to financial transactions, when it comes to some other issues, I follow another marji'. I pick and choose. In the end, they're all experts. Why can't I just pick and choose? I am referring to an expert in every field, in every case. Why do I have to stick to one marja'? This is something that many people are asking today. How do we address that intellectually or rationally?
You can.
You can.
You can.
You can?
You can follow an expert who is the expert, let's say, in the expert in the song. Next marja is an expert in a different area.
Well, the marjas are all experts in all fields. It's a given that they are experts, right? Now, they could be more knowledgeable in certain areas. See, the intellectual law states, if you know for a fact that this particular marja' is the most knowledgeable in the book of prayer and everything that has to do with salah, yes, you have to follow that marja'. You should follow that marja'. And if another marja' is more of an expert, is more knowledgeable in, let's say, the book of transactions, when it comes to interest-based transactions, modern transactions, the current financial institutions, banking system, if you know another marja' is more knowledgeable in that area, or another marja' is more knowledgeable in Hajj, if you know that for a fact, of course you can do taqlid of multiple maraja'. You don't have to stick to one marja. But the question is, first of all, how do you determine that? Is it because the fatwa of that marja is more convenient? The intellect rejects that. It's not about convenience. It's about what is the haqq, what is the truth. So if I know, based on my own research or the expert opinion of a number of scholars, that this marja, he's the best in this field, I can follow that marja, no problem. No marja has an issue with this. So if we're talking about tab'id, selective taqlid, in this, framework, it's fine. We don't have an issue with it. And it's sanctioned by intellectual law, by rational practice. In the end, you're referring to an expert who's the most qualified in that field.
How do you know?
Either you yourself, you have some expertise, you can evaluate, like some students in the seminaries. They're not mujtahids yet, but they have some level of experience to be able to evaluate. Let's say I know this scholar studied 20 years the book of transactions. It seems they better understand the hadiths that have to do with business transactions. And that's my evaluation. Or I could refer to other mujtahids. And I ask them, out of all these maraja' that we have, who's the best in this book, in the book of Salah, in the book of Hajj? Let's say 2 just scholars, mujtahids, testify that X marja' is the most knowledgeable in the book of Hajj, in the book of Salah. I can follow that marja' in the book of Hajj and Salah, no problem. And this is sanctioned by intellectual law, and the maraja' today don't have a problem with this. In fact, they mention it in their book of rulings, that this type of selective taqlid is fine. Yes, brother.
So there's the book of Hajj, there's the book of Salah. What are all the other different categories that you have to take into account when trying to choose a marja', for example?
When we choose a marja', we need someone whom we are confident is the most knowledgeable in pretty much most of the fields, or all the fields.
Okay.
That's the marja' who would be qualified for me to do taqlid of. But let's say I've chosen a marja'. I know in 80% of the rules he seems to be the most knowledgeable. But there's this one marja', I'm confident he's more knowledgeable in this particular field only. Let's say in medical issues, end of life issues. That's fine, I can follow that marja', if that's proven to me with confidence that he is the most knowledgeable. That's fine, this is not something that's rejected by intellectual law. Yes, brother.
The issue that I see with this point, where if you are learned enough to determine which marja' could be the more learned one, I see issues with that. And because if I am, for example, not in the vicinity of these marja'as, the knowledgeable folks, to go and get their opinion, I'm on perhaps a different part of the world. But I've been following the texts myself. So now I have built that confidence in myself. Now I'm going to determine, well, I read the text and this is the one that I feel, my heart feels that this is the right one. So where's the validation process in that?
Now when we say I've read the texts, which texts are we talking about? Is it just the Risala Amaliyah, the book of rulings? Or is it their seminary texts in which they demonstrate how they arrived at that ruling? Makes a difference.
No, seminary texts, for example.
Because if I'm just taking the book of fatwa, some people do that, by the way. They take the book of fatwas, they put them next to each other. Okay, yeah, this seems to make more sense. On what basis are you saying it seems to make more sense? Did you see the process behind it? Did you look at the hadiths that were discussed, the verses of the Quran, the usuli principles, the jurisprudential maxims? A lot of people don't see that. They just put the fatwas next to each other. Yeah, this person seems to be more knowledgeable. That's a wrong way of assessing that. That's like putting 2 prescriptions next to each other and say, oh yeah, this doctor seems more knowledgeable. How are you making that evaluation from a prescription? Why? The way the prescription looks, the words he's put in this prescription? That's not a fair way to make that assessment. Yes, if one is a seminary student or seminary trained or qualified, he's taken the steps to know Islamic law, to know hadith, to know the Arabic language, to understand the principles of the Quran. And they're at a level where they understand what is called Bahth al-Kharij, which is the highest level in the seminary studies. And they look at the encyclopedias of these scholars and they understand them well. Yes, a student like that may be able to give an evaluation. I can put the works of this marja' next to the works of that marja', and see exactly how they took the steps to arrive at that fatwa. And I see that the first marja' seems to be to have a better grasp of the laws and the rulings and in issuing the fatwa. Sometimes a lot of seminary students who are close to ijtihad can make that evaluation. But it requires expertise to even make that evaluation.
How do you determine you have that expertise?
Well, the one who studies these texts for years and years and years, and they do have an understanding of how the fiqh of Ahlul Bayt works, and also they spend time with other scholars, with their peers, and they get feedback from their teachers and scholars that yes, you do seem to understand how the system works. You need that validation. I can't just sit 10,000 miles away in my own room and come up with that assessment. I need to be peer reviewed. Well, how do you get peer reviewed? In the seminaries, either your teacher will engage in lengthy discussions with you and evaluate you and tell you, okay, you're at that level. You're not a mujtahid yet, but you understand what ijtihad is. Or you have other scholars who will give you that validation. So you need that feedback from someone. It's very important to get that feedback.
The one argument that is posed out there, Sayyidina, is that as far as the system of validation goes, has evolved over years for the past 14 centuries. And each decade brings in perhaps a new twist. Now, who authorizes this? Is it the Imam, the 12th Imam, who authorizes this evolvement in processes? Or is it just the average layman scholar out there who decides one year, all right, 5 scholars get together and this is the new thing that we will ingest in society? So how do we know that the actual Imam actually authorizes how it has evolved to this day where it is?
The Imams alayhimus salam, they gave us the major principles. The scholars study these principles and they basically make an effort to figure out how that principle is applied in their society. We have evidence when we talk about the hadiths that the Imams approved of their companions doing exactly that. They give them the general principle, but then how is that principle applied to the conditions of your society? The Imams trusted their scholar companions to do that. So the Imams did sanction that. But the Imams put guidelines. Make sure that these scholars are, first of all, qualified. Number 2, they're pious. They're not people who follow desire. You can trust them. You can trust them with your religion. The Imam stipulated this condition. So as long as that person is an expert and you trust their judgment, they're not influenced by their own whims and desires and temptations. They don't have any personal interests. The Imam ﷺ says, they are my hujjah. They are my proof. Doesn't mean they get everything right. They could get some things wrong. But that's the system that they put in place for us. But I have to do due diligence to know that they are qualified, they are trusted. They're not influenced by their desires. That's something important for me to research. So if these scholars, which in the previous step I've already researched that they are qualified from a knowledge perspective. Number 2, I can trust their taqwa. Whatever they decide and they inject into society, that's something that the Imams approved of. That's the system they gave us during the ghaibah.
I don't mean to take more time, Sayyidina, but you see with these manajas, year after year, there's a new twist where there is now a conflict in that 10% or 5%. And that is echoing much louder within the average communities out there. How is it that these mirages do not come together and mention the fact that what you just mentioned, that for the most part, we are all on the same page for 95% of the rulings? Why is it that the followers of these mirajas are ready to just jump at each other's neck for a certain thing?
A lot of political factors do come into play. Remember, there are political forces wanting to divide the Muslim Ummah, and specifically the Shias. They will actually pay people, they will run media campaigns in order to give that image, that the Maraja are fighting one another, and that it's just there's just chaos at the seminary level and at the social level. So there are groups wanting to take advantage of that. So that 5%, they're amplifying it. Now the followers sometimes may not be the most God-fearing people. They're also driven by their own interests. They line up behind a scholar, that scholar becomes part of their identity, and it even becomes part of their ego. So when they fight for that scholar, or they're trying to defend that scholar, or they're putting down other scholars and followers, in fact, they're serving their ego. We'll talk about that later. In the religion of Ahlul Bayt, the Imams of Ahlul Bayt never told us take a scholar as part of your identity. A scholar is an expert you refer to in their fatwas. That's it. That scholar should not be idolized. That scholar should not become part of your identity. This is something we do find today happening, by the way. But this did not exist at the time of the Imams, or even after the Imams, like we see it today. So the Imams rejected this idea of scholars being idolized. That is why sometimes the Imams themselves would denounce certain scholars that they would see deviating a little bit. And some followers of those scholars were shocked. But this was a hard lesson that they had to learn, the followers of Ahlul Bayt. So sometimes people also don't understand taqlid. Some people, especially those who are a little bit ignorant, when they do taqlid of a scholar, that's it. That scholar becomes the symbol of religion. He becomes infallible. Everything that he says is holy. And I'm willing to go to war just for everything that he said. That's wrong. That's taking it to the extreme. Respect the scholar, absolutely. They are the Hujjah of God on you, the proof of God. But take them as experts, respect them as experts. But for you to idolize them to that extent is wrong. It's something not sanctioned by the Imams of Ahlul Bayt. And we never give the scholars the status of the Ahlul Bayt. Never. This is rejected. The Ahlul Bayt are infallible. You die for them. The scholars are guides. You sacrifice just like they sacrifice. Yes, we defend their institutions because they are a source of guidance, but they're never to be put by the level of the Imams of Ahlul Bayt, even though they are representatives of the Ahlul Bayt.
I have a
Yes.
question, not to deviate from if you don't mind. My problem is understanding, for example, I follow Sayyid Sistani. Some of the brothers I've met during the Hajj, they said, well, you should look into Sayyid Ali Khamenei because of the thing is, he's the wali faqih. I'm not sure if I'm saying it right. Can you elaborate on that?
When we talk about the specifics of taqlid,
So it's gonna be-
we'll examine. Like on what basis should you choose a marja? We'll examine that in detail, yes. So it will come in our next classes, inshallah. One other point about selective taqlid, or at-tab'id fi taqlid. Some people say, look, as long as the marja that I'm following is an expert, that's enough for me. So when it comes, for example, to some dietary requirements in Islam, I choose a marja who's a little bit flexible. So I'll eat that crab legs, I'll eat the lobsters. When it comes to nail polish, right? Maybe I'll choose the minority of scholars who say it does not invalidate the wudu. You can do wudu and you can have the nail polish on, right? For instance. And I just pick and choose. In the end, in every single fatwa, I am referring to an expert. Someone who's qualified. Where's the problem? The problem with this type of selective tab'id is that if you go to each scholar and you take their flexible laws, right? Or their unpopular fatwas, you have confidence that the religion now that you're practicing is a religion different than the religion of the Ahlul Bayt, peace be upon them. Because see, each scholar will have some fatwas that are not common, that are not popular in the seminary. Each scholar. It's a given, right? Maybe 5% of their fatwas, 1% of their fatwas, maybe they're a little bit unusual, not that mainstream. It's a given. But once you collect from each scholar what's not mainstream, you end up with what? A collection of not mainstream fatwas. That gives you confidence this is not the deen that Allah wants for you. I'll give you an example. Each doctor, each physician, maybe in 90% of their judgments, of their understanding of medicine, they're mainstream. Maybe in 3%, 5%, they're not that mainstream. They could, come up with this diagnosis that's not really popular amongst medical experts. Okay. If I have 100 doctors before me, I go to the first doctor and I take that 5%, which is not mainstream, this new twist to diabetes, let's say. And then I go to the second scholar in medicine, the second doctor, and he has this unusual understanding of cancer, let's say. And I take that. And from each one of these doctors, I take that which is unusual and not mainstream. Now when you end up with all these medical opinions, would you feel comfortable by going with this new baggage that you created for yourself now? See, in each item, you have a doctor who said it. There's no doubt about that. Some expert has that opinion. But when you collect unpopular opinions and you create this new thing for yourself, you know for a fact that you're taking a dangerous path. You cannot rely on this new baggage which you just created. Yes?
Why aren't we allowed to do the opposite of that and just find what the scholars are majority, agreed upon? And let's say, okay, Marja A has this uncommon opinion, so I go with, the majority of the other scholars, of the other Marja, they say the other opinion. And then, just go about like that.
If the majority gives you confidence that they are the experts, they have more expertise, obviously you can do that.
Well, maybe they don't give that kind of confidence, but at least you would have the confidence that, okay, I'm closer to what the Ahlul Bayt wanted because more scholars are agreed upon on all of the opinions.
A lot of scholars do allow that type of taqlid, but it's very difficult. It's a burden that not many people can handle, because knowing the mainstream opinion requires a lot of research. You have thousands of laws. Who's going to sit and tell you, okay, the majority of scholars have said this? And that means in every ruling you're going to have to go with the majority, right? That is an added burden. If someone wants to take that burden, fine. That's one level of ihtiyat, one level of precaution. You can do that, definitely. In fact, one alternative to taqlid is to look at all the fatwas and take the most strict one. That way you know for sure you're on the safe side. You can do that. But is that mandatory? Scholars have mentioned this is not mandatory because it's such a heavy burden that the average person cannot handle. You cannot function properly with your daily activities doing this for every single fatwa. So that's definitely an option, but is it mandatory? Or is there a more convenient way maybe the Imams gave us? As long as you trust a scholar and you feel that they are the most knowledgeable in most of the fields, just follow them. Yes, you'd like to exercise caution and go with the majority in certain areas, fine. Let's say your scholar says lobster's halal. Let's say. But the majority say it's haram. Go with the majority. There's absolutely no problem because you're taking a more cautious path. But is it mandatory to do that? That's the discussion. So you see the problem with picking and choosing the fatwas from all these experts, even though we recognize them as experts. Even if we say it's not mandatory to follow the most knowledgeable, just follow any expert. But if you take the fatwa that's convenient, that's unusual, that's not mainstream, from each scholar, what you end up with is problematic. What you end up with is far from the truth. Do you see the idea here? Or do you have any objections to this? Any objections to this point? Because today there is a big movement that's pushing for this. Choose any scholar in any field, in any fatwa, as long as they're experts, go with their expertise.
Saying that, doesn't that mean you have to know all their fatwas?
Yes, that also requires that you do know their fatwas, sure. That in itself is something maybe a lot of people are not willing to research.
What about if your intellect is convincing you that you're thinking of a certain ruling along the lines of what your intellect is dictating to you. You find two scholars and you think, there you go. The fact that I'm thinking this, and there are two scholars who are considered scholars support this too, I must be right.
But why are you thinking this? Because of convenience? Because of what?
Because of conviction that I have read a few things and it makes sense logically when I compare it to, because it comes down as far as Western philosophy goes versus Eastern philosophy. There are things that you look in different contexts. In one context, something could make sense, which is the exact opposite of the other side.
What needs to make sense is always the general principle. Taqlid making sense, yes, it should be rational. But when you get to the level of detail, that's not an area where logic should be implemented. That's how our religion works. When you look at the fiqhi rulings, right? Stoning the devil in Hajj, the rak'ahs that we have, the way you do them, is that something that you subject to logic? If a marji' says the takbirah should be done this way, another marji' says a different way, is this an area where my logic can have any influence? In the details, logic should not have any influence. Logic, yes. When it comes to the main principle, why you do taqlid? Are you following the most learned? Logic over there can be exercised. But once you come to the application itself, logic cannot be used over here. That would be unfair evaluation. So even if you read a few things about a certain fatwa, that in itself is not enough to tell you, okay, this scholar is more of an expert. You have to look at the sources which the scholars examined and the mechanism they used to issue those fatwas. That's key. That's what's important. Yes.
So let's say, for example, that I'm following a marja that I believe is the most not knowledgeable, and I agree with like everything, and then that marja comes out with a fatwa that like just does not make sense to me. Would that mean that I can't follow that marja?
No, you should still follow that marja.
But what if
Because why doesn't that fatwa not make sense?
like, for example, I'm following
Because you've studied Islamic law and hadith and Quran for 20 years and you're an expert and you can see that it's fallacious? If that's the case, sure, no problem. Is there an expert scholar who showed that to you or no?
like for example.
Afwan, we have to go to the salah.
Okay,
وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وآله الطاهرين.